Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm Dominic Henderson, country head of Sodali Japan. Welcome to this webinar. Before we start, just a few housekeeping notes, if I may. Please make sure your microphone is muted. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a switch to enable you to, a button enable you to switch between English and Japanese. Also, we would welcome you to enter your questions into the Q&A box. I'm pleased to say we already have some questions that have come in. This webinar is being recorded. Please note that the playback, though, will only be available in English. Today's topic is entitled Bridging the ESG Expectation Gap. The presentation reflects the feedback from foreign investors about Japanese companies' ESG practices, and will be given by Heather Prosser, who's our Managing Director and Head of Sustainability for Japan. But first, please let me say a few words about Sodali & Co. After several acquisitions around the world, we rebranded from Moro Sodali to Sodali & Co. in July of this year. Our company originally focused on shareholder services, including shareholder identification, shareholder engagement, and proxy solicitation services. Over the years, we've grown a governance and sustainability consulting business, and most recently, strategic communications. We're a global company with offices in North America, South America, the major cities of Europe, and throughout the Asia-Pacific region. We work with over 2,000 clients and work in 70 countries. So I'd like to hand over now, please, to Heather Prosser. Heather, over to you.
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you, everyone who decided to take their time with us this afternoon to talk about what we think is a very exciting survey and talk about some of the results and really what impact and what perspectives you can derive from this that will help you in your sustainability journey, no matter where you are. For today, our agenda is going to be the introduction to the study. We'll talk about some key findings. We'll look at some of the investor priorities and certainly, and probably what's most interesting to many of you, recommendations for Japanese companies. And we'll end with Q&A as Dominic suggested. So if you've got important questions that come up through, please, again, use the chat, and then we'll try and address them all towards the end. So as Dominic mentioned, I am the Managing Director and Head of Sustainability for Japan and for Sodali here in Japan. And so when I'm looking at sustainability overall, which is a really important topic for me, if you in sustainability, some really fill my heart with delight and others dismay. So I've really been impressed overall by the manner with which Japanese companies in particular have taken ESG and sustainability really on board. And they've really worked to incorporate it into their way of doing business. But I've been a little dismayed, quite frankly, at the lack of recognition that Japanese companies have received for this. They're not necessarily considered leaders, or are they? This is one of the key questions, one of the reasons why we did this survey. And if you think about the term ESG and sustainability, of course, sustainability overall is the big overarching idea where we want to thrive both in all ways possible while still not doing damage to the planet or people. ESG as a terminology is really focused on risk management. So for the purposes of this study and this webinar, I'm going to focus on the term ESG exclusively, but it does kind of encompass more than that. But we'll use ESG because what we're looking at is how do investors evaluate you based on different metrics. And ESG, though a difficult and not necessarily perfect acronym and quite challenging acronym these days, is still maybe the best we have to look at this issue. So when we consider ESG overall, we do see some some challenges in the world as to, how serious is it? Is the backlashes that we're going to, or that we've seen in the US particularly, is that going to change investors' minds? So there's a lot of really interesting questions when you look at the future of sustainable investing and sustainability. What role will it play moving forward? But for the purpose of our study, what we're really looking at is we wanted to understand perception. So this study isn't about truth. And I think if there's one thing I want you to really take away, is that this is the perception of foreign investors on Japanese companies' ESG efforts. Now, perception we can change. Truth would be maybe a little bit more challenging. So let's keep that in mind as we move forward. So a few notes on the methodology. So again, what we were looking to do is to understand how foreign investors are looking at Japanese companies and to understand their perceptions. Again, that very important word. And when you understand their perceptions, then we can understand what opportunities Japanese companies have to really impress their investors. The way we conducted this survey was by online survey, and we did this between June and August of this year. This is not a huge survey. This is not 1,000 respondents, but what we did is we had great global representation. We had 31 full responses that were received and 26 that were fully analyzed because they were the most complete ones. So again, not a huge study, but very, very telling. We really tried to divide between region, which is not indicated here on this slide, but also between type of investor. So you can see on our slide there whether they were passive, active, both, what strategies they employed there, which teams were we looking at, whether it be the proxy teams, the stewardship teams, and whether they were part of an investment team or the fund manager. So I think from that perspective, I'm pretty pleased with the variety and the diversity of responses that we got. Many people have asked, how were these investors chosen? Well, we looked heavily through our Sodali global networks. We have an excellent network of people and investors who we're close to, but we also looked very specifically at investors that were ICGN related and connected. Were they PRI signatories, for example? And probably most important for everyone here is the assets under management represented by this group of people, again, a small group of people, but very powerful. This was about 913 billion US dollars. And that's about 43% of the total foreign shareholdings in the Japanese stock market. So it is a small sample size by numbers, but actually that's a huge amount of investable assets here in Japan. So that's what makes some of these weightings of perception a little bit more important, a little bit weightier. So just one other quick point before we kind of dig into some of the key findings. Towards the end of this presentation, you will have a QR code, which you can then go to and download the report directly. So the report is actually in Japanese and in English. So you can choose which one that you will want. So we'll be presenting that a little bit later today. So let's dig into some of the key findings that we thought were most important for this, knowing that our full report actually contains a lot more information, but this is the high level stuff. And please forgive me, I was trying to work with animation here and it's not really clearly my strong suit, so apologies for that animation coming out a little funny. Let's start at the beginning. One of the things, and we're going to start off with a positive point. The positive point here being is that Japanese companies are believed to be doing well in two key areas. That is ESG strategy integration and sustainable supply chain. Now, sustainable supply chain, actually, I want to just take a moment on that because that is a very, very difficult one to get right. in my experience, a lot of Japanese companies have for many, many years been trying to get a handle on their supply chain. And it's usually tier one is very, very easy. But once you go past your tier one suppliers, it gets really challenging. And my feeling is one of the reasons why foreign investors found that Japanese companies were very good in sustainable supply chain is because Japanese companies took scope 3 up really quickly and started to look at it very seriously, more probably faster than some of the other global companies. I mean, part of that is just being in Asia as well. We have the world supply chain here in front of us in this day and age, and we really are taking that quite seriously. It's not a far away issue for us. So I think if we have this perception again that foreign investors think that Japanese companies are doing great in sustainable supply chain and ESG integration, these are great points, and this is something that we should be proud of. If we had done the study asking about ESG integration with American companies, for example, the result would be very, very different, very different. But then we found a lot of challenges, and I want to get to point 2 because point 2 is that, again, kind of fills me with dismay. So what we did is we asked investors, if you know, out of 100, whatever your perfect company is, what's the highest Japanese company that you would rate? What would it be? 100? Would it be 99? And it was, and I'm going to say it was only 68. It was a little bit, technically a little bit, I think it was 67.6%, or 67.6. We didn't get higher than that. So I grew up in America. So for me, that's getting like a D plus. You know, you didn't really get a C, and you certainly didn't get a B or an A. That's not great. That's not great. But the average Japanese company only scored 45. Now, is that true? Are Japanese companies that far behind the ideal ESG company? I don't think so. I truly don't think so. None of my work over the years indicates that that's the case. But if foreign investors are thinking that, that makes me concerned. That makes me very concerned. And I think we need to look at this. Now, if I dig into that a little bit, one of the things I have to say is whenever if anyone here has ever done a survey or done a report like this in the past for the first time on a particular issue, they know that usually you get more questions than you get answers. So one of the questions I failed to ask here is, you know, which companies would you think are number one companies in the world for sustainable? What would be closest to 100 point score, right? There's not that many. There's not going to be that many. Where would the majority fall? Or, you know, are European companies actually falling around that 68 number, or are they closer to an 80 or a 90, right? So I feel like as we move forward and, you know, repeat this over the years, I think this is one of the things that we would want to dig into. My feeling on this, though, is still the most important aspect is how are Japanese companies perceived, right? So I feel like we as Japanese companies could do better. Number 3 is not going to be a surprise to anybody. These are investors. Most of them are relatively long-term investors, to very, very long-term investors. Governance is always going to be the top issue. Investors don't like risk. They like things to be moving smoothly along. Governance is always going to be something that is clearly an issue. So many people who have heard me speak in the past will know that if you say E, S, and G, I always say if your G is bad, it doesn't matter what your E and S are doing because you have a shaky foundation for your house. So governance is always going to be very, very important there. When we're looking through number 4, ESG. So ESG is going to heavily influence investment decisions. And what I'd really like to drive home on that is how do you judge that? And a lot of investors have a multitude of choices for ESG rankings and ratings companies, but MSCI and Sustainalytics by far come out to be the most trusted. And we're going to get into what the implications are for you on that moving forward. Number 5. One of the things that came out here, and again, we're talking about perceptions, was that Japanese companies were really good at mapping their material issues, but investors didn't fully feel that they were looking at their most important and addressing their most important. And that is something I think is a real issue. So if your investors don't think you're addressing your biggest material risks, that's an opportunity to have a conversation. So we need to look at that more, and we will moving forward. And finally, number 6. So 3 of the key areas where we found where, for some reason, foreign investors do not think Japanese companies are doing enough is climate change action. And we're going to dig into all these as well. Human rights and board diversity. Now, board diversity probably is one of the easiest ones to address initially, because we know that that's a challenge overall. Diversity is an issue here in Japan. There's been a lot more activity trying to get more independent board members, more female board members, foreign board members, more diversity, but the numbers are still quite low. And I feel like that's something that's not going to be shocking to anybody. Human rights as well as climate change action, I have to admit, were a bit surprising to me, because I see a lot of action here. So why aren't the foreign investors, right? So let's dig into these a little bit more. And we're going to look at, again, a little bit deeper on some of these priority areas. Let's look at this first again, because when we're looking at this and how do Japanese companies really stack up against the kind of ideal company, these foreign companies. So we do see a bit of differentiation between what an asset owner and asset manager is saying, but not a huge amount, really, not a massive amount there. And really, whether they were active or passive, we didn't see a huge difference overall between the type of investor, the type of strategy, and their overall feeling. So we have some that said, if you look down in the 3rd section, there are active investors in Japan. This is probably the highest that we saw, where we see the ideal Japanese company was ranking a little bit higher than our average at 73.1. We've got, passive investors, again, looking at 71.6. But when we're looking really the overall averages and the totals there, we're still looking at the average Japanese company coming out at 45, and then the best performing at 67.6. So this is really concerning, again, because this isn't representing truth. There's not necessarily one way of measuring sustainability. So what this says to us at Sodali is there is an absolute opportunity here to grow and to actually turn some of these perceptions around on their head. And I think that is something that is a huge opportunity. So the message from the investors is really clear. Japanese companies are not considered leaders in sustainability. I would think, my assertion is that that's wrong, at least for many companies. And maybe the assumption by foreign investors is that Japanese companies should be leaders. And maybe that's culturally not really where the companies here are looking to go. But I think this is one of those opportunities we have to really show and showcase some of the amazing work that you're doing. And so I think that's a really key issue that we see here that, again, is based on perception, but we should be able to close that gap without actually having to do too much more work. And we'll get into how you do that a little bit later. Now let's look at some of the areas of performance. And when we're looking at this here, so let's look again at some of those positives. So Japanese companies do show leadership in embedding their ESG strategy into their business model, and building their sustainable supply chain. So that is very positive. We're very, very happy about that. But when you're looking at specific issues, again, we mentioned that there would be specific issues, in particularly around climate change. Decarbonization came out as a really big topic, and decarbonization being really bold with ambitions, having clear strategy around that. This was a little bit surprising that foreign investors didn't feel that Japanese companies were doing enough there. So again, we'll get into that a little bit later. Human rights. Now, human rights has been a challenge all over the world. And this is one that this wasn't a big surprise here. I think that's something that is that one, along with diversity and inclusion, not a big surprise that we would be, as Japanese companies, marked down a little bit on that one. And then if you look at two of the other points here, I was a little bit disappointed to see that the promotion of mental health for employees and work-life balance was not more prioritized by foreign investors. Please don't let that mean that you stop paying attention to those things. Like, please do keep doing that work. But if we did this study 5 years ago, mental health wouldn't have been even a topic. Work-life balance might have been, but definitely mental health wouldn't have even made a list of investors' concerns. So it'll be very, very interesting to see that move in the matrix in the future for investors, because it's becoming so much more of a topic than it ever really used to be. Now, there's definitely a lot more topics in here, so we tried to group them together to make sure that these were representative. But it's really instructive here, because the reason why we chose some of these here is there's clearly work that we can easily do on some of this by better disclosure, better communications, better engagement, right? I see a lot of activity here, and I feel like some of this could be low-hanging fruit. Other bits are going to be a little bit more difficult. So let's take a look here. So we always say ESG, so we have environmental, social, or governance. What is the most interesting one? And it's good governance. It is going to be good governance by a country mile. Now, this is misleading, this chart. So if you look and you say 80% really feel, it's governance at 80%, it's 65%, people would think, yes, that got some of the investors excited. Environmental. When you're looking at the different types of investors, their strategy in this case might make a big difference as to whether they're going to be more environmentally focused or socially focused. So I think that's something to take into consideration. Again, governance is the bedrock of your company. So if you've got bad governance, of course, it makes sense that these other areas wouldn't matter. But what I don't want you to take from this slide is, okay, well, we need to focus more on social and maybe a little bit less on environmental. The way I read this, and again, there are some differentiations between the way an active investor and a passive investor is looking at this, but the way we're looking at it from Sodali's perspective is environmental related metrics have been honestly around a little bit longer. They are a little bit easier to understand and to take a look at. A lot of it is very easily quantifiable. So investors have become very, very comfortable with environmental metrics. The social related metrics have really started to gain more popularity in the past 5, 6, 7 years or so, but they present a great deal of challenge. So anyone that's tried to evaluate the impact of a social program will tell you that it's highly dependent on how you're judging it, how you're scoring it. So does this mean that all companies should be focused across all of these equally? No, it's really going to depend on what type of company you are, and where your materiality falls. But if your governance is strong and you have more environmental focus and more environmental risk, it would make sense that you would be more focused there. Social related metrics as well and have to be represented. So unfortunately, there's no easy way to make sure you're addressing all of these issues to the point that you're going to make everyone happy, but it's still important to take a look at. So what this says to me as well is it should be really clear to your investors how you're measuring from a governance perspective. How are you measuring? How are you overall managing your social and your environmental sides as well? So let's look at the governance piece next. So we asked the investors really looking at some of the key issues that they're thinking about today. And if we had done this again 5 years ago, if we do this 5 years in the future, some of these will change around. These tend to change a lot when there are specific issues, specific scandals, for example, within governance and issues. But for Japanese companies, specifically board composition comes up a lot. And we've got a bit of a point here that is if we're looking at Japanese female ratio on the board for listed companies, the prime market was 13.4% in 2023. Guys, I think we can do better than that. But it's challenging. So when we speak to companies on boards and board composition, one of the things that tends to come up is there's not enough of a pipeline of qualified women who can go on to boards. Okay, let's assume for the moment that that is the case. Well, then if this is an important issue, what you should be doing is making sure that you're grooming people that can come up and can start to be part of that, whether that's, I mean, not an independent director, but if they're executive board members, grooming more diverse people that can be considered for board positions in the future. You're already grooming a lot of your male candidates without even thinking about it. So there needs to be more active programs within the companies where you're looking at growing more talent and making sure that diversity and composition from a gender perspective, for example, is something that you're able to do in the future. You can't snap your fingers and make this happen. This will take some time. Shareholder rights, of course, comes up as a really important point. I don't think I need to discuss that one too much. I think that one's pretty obvious. No surprises there. Of course, these other issues were pretty high too. Business ethics being very important as another example, but not necessarily a key issue for Japanese companies. Not in the sense that investors are worried about business ethics. It's more in the sense that this is something that they do consider through investment decisions. Risk management would always show up. I save executive compensation for last because this has traditionally been something that's been really black box here in Japan. And to be fair, most parts of the world. I'm American by birth and by passport. For Americans, it's, talking about how much money you make is a big taboo. Within your company, people wouldn't know. Within your teams, your family wouldn't know how much money you make. So being really transparent on employee compensation is not just a matter of finance and the finance department and HR department kind of getting together. We actually have to start to change cultural norms around this. And we certainly see this here in Japan as well. If we're looking for an example against executive compensation in the US, the average US CEO gets paid an astronomical amount more than the average employee. That is a lot closer here in Japan, much to the benefit, I think, of Japanese companies. So the details around how each of the mechanics in these issues would work would be very different if we were talking about another country. So make sure you kind of keep that in your head there. Moving on to the social aspect. So this is a notoriously difficult piece to look at. Again, for the aforementioned reasons that the social side is typically harder to quantify. It is harder to overall measure with any degree of success. It is not impossible, but it is definitely a really big challenge. So I'm going to kind of start one that's a little bit different, not from the top, a little bit one from the bottom, employee health and safety. This is an issue that foreign investors look at and consider very seriously, but in fact, Japanese companies do environmental health and safety quite well, and really, really well overall. So in some senses, Japanese companies were leading for a long time in employee health and safety when you look at factory specific work. But we've started to broaden out that idea of what does employee safety look like? What do labor rights and human rights, obviously the very, very top there. So when you look at UN Global Compact, for example, many companies are signatories and affiliated with the Global Compact. We're looking to ensure human rights. But what does that mean? So I've had meetings with clients who felt human rights is not a problem we have in Japan. That's a problem we have in our supply chain. It's a problem we have outside of Japan. But in fact, that's not the case. And I think we're starting to realize that human rights includes, of course, gender, sexuality, religion, citizenship, all of these different areas. And if we take a Japan specific example, we look at labor practices, for example, and we look at the rates of suicides based on overwork or suicides overall, right? But if you look at that overwork, the fact that we actually have a word for that here in Japan, kiroshi overall, like that's something that we start to look at and we consider, okay, well, human rights here in Japan has a specific flavor. And again, I keep getting back to how it would compare elsewhere, because when you're looking at how do you address these concerns, you have to understand and really be able to make your foreign investors understand what the flavor of human rights is here. So what does that mean here? How are we addressing that here? What does diversity and inclusion mean here? So diversity and inclusion is a great example because a lot of foreign investors, if you're in Europe, for example, the Americas, you might think people from every color and creed and size and whatnot, because if you look very specifically at the US population, it's such a very diverse population overall. So you want to be more representative. Whereas diversity and inclusion here in Japan does not mean having more people that look like me in your company, but maybe having more women, maybe having, instead of only hiring people from Keio or Todai, you're hiring people from smaller university backgrounds or mid-career hires, people that come with different ideas. So you have to remember that when you're talking to foreign investors, their idea of these terms needs to be checked. What do they mean by DAE and I? What do they mean by human rights and labor practices? Because these are not black and white terms. They're very much stuck into the cultural background where that person or that company is sitting. So maybe part of the perception gap and the challenges that we found in this survey are because these terms do not clearly translate to one checklist of things. And I think this is something we really need to take into account. We move on to the environmental aspects. Greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity and land use really topped investor concerns, 100%, 100%. And what we've got a great quote over there by Larry Fink, who's really championed a lot of sustainable investing. And even though it looks like BlackRock has really backpedaled on sustainable investing, I would actually suggest that they're changing the terminology more than anything else and really continuing on. But the areas where you need to be focused as a company to really not just impress your investors, but to really help them understand your sustainability programs are going to be greenhouse gases, biodiversity, and land use. So what we overall found in the study was that it wasn't really believed that Japanese companies were doing enough with these two areas. Now, again, is that truth or is that perception? Biodiversity and land use, I think we're having more challenges here trying to really quantify that, really look at. I mean, we've got things like TNFD right now to look at your nature-based resources, but it's not a perfect framework. It's really complicated. Your sustainability teams might understand it, but your C-suite is probably not quite there yet. So although I think biodiversity and land use is a really big issue, I would probably say most companies worldwide are still struggling with that. But greenhouse gas emissions, there's no reason why investors looking at Japan should not see all of the great work that is happening here in Japan. So I think that's maybe even low-hanging fruit of making sure that they're understanding what you're doing. Moving on, one of the key things, and I mentioned it early on, that we got out of this study was that investors didn't necessarily think that Japanese companies were addressing their most important material issues. And what we've seen through a lot of ESG disclosures, sustainability reports, is that Japanese companies tend to have a lot of different material issues. And that's fair. That's actually very true. I mean, we look at this slide here and we represent some as big and some as small. Usually it's on a matrix, but you can do these kind of bubble charts as well. Most global companies are going to have all of these issues and more, absolutely more. But what foreign investors really felt was that you probably can't be great at all of them, and you probably need to focus on your most important. What are going to be financially impactful for you? And I think that's something that we need to consider. If that's not clearly coming out to investors, that's something that I think we can really work on and fix. I mentioned this in the top 6 key findings that we had in the beginning. Now, one of the things that our team has spent a lot of time on is helping companies improve their ESG scores. A lot of companies want to improve them. Makes complete sense. But many companies are trying to get all perfect scores across many of these different. Now, this is only a few, actually, of a very large ecosystem of ratings and rankings that are available to you. Let's be honest, most of your sustainability teams are going to be small and under-resourced. And if they are spending all of their time focused on getting ratings from all of the different major providers, and this is truly major providers, you're wasting time and you're wasting resources. What we clearly found overwhelmingly is that MSCI ESG ratings and Sustainalytics are by far the most trusted and used by foreign investors. Now, what that says to me is that you need to focus your resources on getting great scores in your MSCI or Sustainalytics. Now, your investors may not subscribe to this. Maybe your investors are actually the ones that are only looking at Bloomberg or only looking at S&P. Do you know what your investors are really looking at? Do you know what your where they're getting their sustainability ratings and information from? If you do not, that's something that should be analyzed. That is something, sorry, a very self-serving comment. That is something we do help companies analyze is really what their top investors are looking at, and where are they getting their sustainability information, so what influences them, therefore where should you focus your efforts. So several companies I've spoken to really kind of take this beauty pageant approach. They really want great scores across all of them. Again, it's a waste of your resources. All of these companies are competing with each other to be the number one, to be the best. Now, and Sodali has no affiliation with MSCI or with Sustainalytics. We don't get any kickback from saying, we think you should focus here. But if your investors are looking there, your other stakeholders don't care what your ratings are. Only your shareholders are going to care. Do what your investors are most interested in. Focus on that. Don't focus on the rest of them. It's a very unpopular comment, I admit, but we feel very strongly about this. We're trying to save you time. I want to get into just one more point before we move on to the recommendations that we have for you. Communication. So one of the real challenges we see with a lot of sustainability teams here nowadays is they're spending a lot of time on disclosure and not a lot of time on what they consider, maybe what I would consider, real sustainability. More initiatives, like trying to improve your sustainability program, make it more robust, make it stronger. Instead, they're spending a lot of time on disclosure. Now, regulatory disclosure makes absolute sense. Do as much regulatory disclosure as you have to, do it well. But many companies have come to us and said, why don't my stakeholders, not just my shareholders, why don't my stakeholders care or even know about all of the great sustainability work we've been doing? We've been doing it for years. We think we're maybe even leaders in this area. We spend a lot of time and effort in this. It's because your shareholders may be reading your sustainability report, but your stakeholders, their broader group of stakeholders, are not. They're not going to read your sustainability report. So when you're thinking about communication is really three things. It is, of course, your ESG disclosures on a mandatory and a voluntary basis, but it's your shareholder and stakeholder communication. It's that piece, and that communication is internal and external. You're really making sure that not only are you presenting facts, but on your website, on your products, in your shops, and in whatever way you interact with the world, that sustainability, if it's important to you, is part of that conversation, part of the way you communicate as a company, not a separate piece that you hide over on your website on one side, but it's part of the way you communicate about your company. And the third piece is engagement. Active engagement by Japanese companies is what foreign investors are looking for. I'm going to say that again because it's so important. Active engagement by Japanese companies is what foreign investors are looking for. I don't know how many times IR teams have said, yes, we were prepared for those questions about sustainability, but nobody asked us, so we moved on. What a wasted opportunity. You've spent a lot of time, a lot of money on your sustainability program. You've hired expensive consultants to help you with your sustainability program. You must engage actively with your investors. They want to hear from you on what you're doing. One of the things that really came out is that foreign investors felt Japanese companies were too passive in their communication on these areas. That's an easy fix. That is really an easy fix. You've already got great programs. And this is why I think this is not a truth. This is a perception management issue. You've got great programs. People are not hearing them. And I think this is what you need to focus on. I'm aware of time and I do want to get to your questions. So let me move forward to some of the recommendations. I don't think any of this will be a surprise because I've been kind of communicating these points. That top one, understand what your investors are concerned with and communicate these proactively. Really start to strategize how are you going to fill some of these gaps, particularly around board diversity? You're not going to be able to fix them today. You need to start to think now about how you're going to be doing this. Focusing on your material issues, fill in your knowledge gaps. So if you're going to be communicating more and engaging more on sustainability issues, is your board ready to do that? Are all your senior executives ready to do that? Make sure that they're ready. Get them extra training if they need to. Get them to understand how these issues impact the company's bottom line, and they will be great spokespeople for you. Disclose and communicate. Again, I couldn't say this enough. Measure and be transparent. It's really sustainability 101. Be very transparent about what you're doing and how you're doing it. Tell your story. And really have, and the report goes into this more than I've gone into in this, but really having ambitious targets, particularly for GHG emissions. I think that's something that investors really wanted to see more of. Many companies here are very nervous about being too ambitious in case they talk about a goal or a target that they don't meet, but maybe we could still find a good compromise there. Use frameworks like TNFD, as we talked about with biodiversity, to really start to move forward on some of these investor-focused issues. So wrapping up, just ahead, some of the key takeaways I'd like you to really think about. I know there's a lot of information in a short period of time. In a moment, I'll show you the QR code, which you can download the report yourself. But what I want you to take away is there are absolutely opportunities for you to become leaders in sustainability from an investor perspective. And this is, it really behooves you to take a look at this seriously. Understand their expectations. Be efficient with your teams. Focus your teams on the most impactful work that they can do in sustainability that's going to help further your goals. And really think of sustainability not as an annoying thing that you have to do, but as a strategic leverage point for your businesses and for your strategy moving forward. I think we couldn't say more how important that could be. So as promised, if you would like a copy of the report is in English and Japanese. This QR code will take you to a registration page, which I'm sorry, the registration page is name, email address, very simple things. And unfortunately, that one is only in English, but if you go through that, you can right-click for Google Translate if you need, but you will receive an email in English and Japanese, giving you the option of downloading either the English or Japanese report. And if you don't get this here right now, don't worry. Everyone here who's on this webinar will get both the recording of this event, but also you'll get a link to the report. We'll be sending that out likely tomorrow. So I'm going to switch slides in a moment. So if you haven't put your phone up to your screen, don't worry. You will be able to soon. Finally, I just we met Dominic, who is on the call. He'll handle the Q&A section. We also have a great team, including Andrew Vasey, Tahada-san, Kinomura-san, and Ueda-san, all here in Japan to help service your needs. So with that, in 11 minutes to go, I will invite back Dominic to address some of your questions. So first off, thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope this was useful for you.
That's great, Hannah. Thanks. We've actually got quite a few questions, so we definitely will not be able to get through all of them. So I apologize in advance to people, but there's one question that came in earlier, and I think you've probably touched on some of this already, but let me read it out to you. Do Japanese organizations really have an understanding of the financial benefits of ESG, or is it just seen as a cost that they have to take?
That's a great question. I don't think any company fully appreciates the benefits of sustainability at the moment. I think they have a very, very good understanding of the risk. Risk is much easier for people to understand, but the benefit side and really the upside of sustainability is a lot harder for us to model, and it's a lot harder for us to understand. So I would say, no, I don't think Japanese companies, but I don't think companies in general have a really good understanding of the benefits of sustainability. I think part of that is also because sustainability is still relatively new and it's quite changeable. So the way I talk about sustainability today is very, very different from how I spoke about it in 2015, for example, and that, just so that short period of time. I think we'll get there, but I think it's still evolving.
Okay, thanks for that. Let me move on to another one. Um, I have no objection in increasing the female ratio in the board, but
I'm
what
delighted. I'm delighted to hear that.
but what would happen after we achieve the increased ratio? Is there any model case that demonstrates a causal relationship between increasing the number of female executives and improved business performance?
That is a great question. I'd probably have to look up at the statistics, which I don't keep in my head, but there is an absolute positive relationship to more diversity and better corporate performance, particularly when you're considering business decisions. So one of the real challenges of diversity is that people don't agree with each other. And it is much more challenging to arrive at the end solution. But if you have diverse minds, for example, instead of homogenous minds, the likelihood of you coming up with the type of response that is going to protect you and give you the better opportunity with a diverse team is much higher. So we have found that, and there's some great studies on that. I'd have to take a look, and maybe we can send a follow-up email to the person who's asked this question specifically. But there's some great studies out there that show higher diversity equals better corporate performance overall. So I think that's something that we feel very strongly about. It's not a tick the box, get some more women on, nothing's going to change, it doesn't make a difference. We're going to work differently as a company, and we're going to think differently. So it's a much bigger proposition.
Okay, thanks. I would add to it, the CLSA did some work on this a couple of years ago. The strategist Nicholas Smith wrote about that. He was focusing more on the share price performance, I believe. But yeah, we'll try and follow up with that one. Okay, probably time for a couple more. Do you think the results would be very different if the questions were asked to Japanese investors? It would be helpful to understand why the difference, if there are differences, so that we can close the gap.
Oh, goodness. Again, this is a great question, and I wish we had designed the study and the survey to actually have a bifurcation between foreign investors' perspective and Japanese investors' perspective. Yes, I do think there would be some differences. I think that specific topics would be different within the ESG. I think we'd see Japanese investors focusing on different areas. But I still think that they would probably be scoring Japanese companies quite low, and probably even lower than foreign investors do. I think there's a mindset here that, oh, we're not very good at this. We're kind of, we're lagging. We're not very good. I don't think there's enough pride in the work that's happening by Japanese companies. So I think there would be a huge difference. And now you've given us a great idea for how we can maybe impress you next time with an even better survey. So thank you for the question.
I think I'd like to add to that, because both foreign investors and Japanese institutional investors do share one view, which is that they get frustrated with companies that come out with a strategy that isn't very clearly argued. It's too vague. The JPX has just released a very interesting paper on that, with real life cases, without naming the company, but real life cases of a company's disclosure and then the investors' opinions of that. So yeah, Okay.
Excellent.
Let me ask you a rather more topical one. So earlier this year, I mean, you touched on this a little bit, but earlier this year, we started to see pushback against ESG in the US investing. Now that Trump will be the next president, how might this change how investors evaluate the ESG performance of companies?
Oh, great question. Great question. So during the first Trump presidency, actually, I remember people coming up to me and saying, "Oh, well, I guess your team is going to get shut down. You're not going to be doing sustainability consulting. People aren't going to do this anymore." What we found is it didn't really make a difference. It certainly didn't make a difference here in Japan for the activity level of an interest in sustainability. But what we did see in the US and what we will see again is what we call green hushing. So we've already started to see this in the US. A few years ago, there started to be a larger ESG backlash that was not necessarily related to Trump, though very heavily focused on Republican states. Primarily, if you look at the origins of that ESG backlash, it really came from oil and gas companies, and they have very, very powerful lobbying arms in Congress, excuse me, in Washington, that have pushed forward their agenda. Now, some of the pushback against ESG, I think, is fair. I think, perhaps it's overpromised and underdelivered, but overall, I think what we've seen is we've seen this pushback where it's self-serving. We've seen this pushback through parts of the sectors in the United States. We've seen this in Australia as well, big mining country. We've seen a lot of pushback against ESG. Haven't seen it as much in Japan, have not seen it as much in Europe, for example. So will the Trump presidency start to change how we're looking at sustainability here in Japan? No, I don't think so. Will it impact the US? Absolutely. But when you look at renewables just in the United States, for example, renewables have actually become a bigger part of the energy matrix and are getting cheaper and cheaper. They're actually great investments. They did well under the Trump first administration and likely are going to continue to. We're going to build more companies and focus more on particularly with the isolationist ideas of the Trump America's First policy. It makes more sense to be as independent as possible, which could have positive and negative implications for sustainability. So it'll be very interesting to see. Watch this space for more.
Okay. And I'm going to squeeze in one more question. This is an honest question.
Okay.
It's a short question. Hopefully, there'll be a short answer.
Oh no.
Do investors really pay attention to ESG ratings?
No, not as much as you'd like to think. Every investor I've ever spoken to looks at the ratings, but they have an internal way of measuring. So if your ratings are bad, you're not getting that check mark from the investor. But I have never met an investor that only goes by external ratings and says, "Oh, well, they've marked really highly in MSCI, so they must be great in sustainability." So it's not the only thing that they're going to look at. They'll have other ways of evaluating it, but if you're terrible, it will definitely be a strike against you. I answered that as fast as I possibly could.
No, that's great. No, perfect timing. We are going to wrap up here. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining. As Heather mentioned, the report will be available tomorrow, or you can access via the QR code. And as will be a recording of this, but unfortunately, that will only be in English. So thank you very much for attending, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Please do let us know if you have questions.